Russia canceled the last nuclear treaty with the U.S. The whole West watched anxiously. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Join me today. The Budapest summit was supposed to be a lifeline, a fragile bridge across the widening gulf between Washington and Moscow. It was planned as a symbolic gesture, a chance to pause the accelerating descent into mistrust. Diplomats described it as a last window before the door closes. Yet that window slammed shut when the United States abruptly canceled the summit, citing Russia's continued aggression and non-compliance with international norms. For Moscow, it wasn't a statement of principle, it was a slap in the face. In Russian political psychology, humiliation is never forgotten. Within hours, the Kremlin's media machine framed the cancellation as the final betrayal of American arrogance. Putin, ever the tactician of symbolism, seized the moment. On state television, he declared that Russia would no longer be bound by treaties with those who do not respect dialogue. The next morning, Moscow officially suspended its participation in the last remaining nuclear arms control treaty with the United States, the final legal remnant of a global effort that once kept civilization's doomsday clock at bay. That single decision marked more than a diplomatic rift. It was the death of an era. Since the late 1982, arms control treaties from INF to New START were the invisible architecture of restraint, the quiet grammar of survival between two nuclear giants. Now, grammar has been shattered. And then came the announcement that turned shock into dread. Russia had successfully launched the Burevestnik missile, a nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed cruise missile capable of flying indefinitely, circling the globe at low altitude, invisible to radar, unstoppable by any known defense. Western analysts once dismissed the project as science fiction, but on that day it became fact. To the Kremlin, the launch was a declaration of resurrection. You cannot contain us. To Washington, it was a moment of vertigo, a reminder that power and control were slipping out of reach. Pentagon officials called the missile a nightmare that erases warning time. In the words of one analyst, it doesn't just change the balance of power, it removes the balance entirely. What makes the Burevestnik terrifying is not only its destructive potential, but its symbolism. It represents the end of reason when technology outruns diplomacy, when fear becomes a weapon of pride. Russia's message was clear: if you refuse to talk to us, we will build something you cannot stop. In this way, the cancellation of a summit in Hungary, a simple political gesture, triggered a global shift. The United States thought it was isolating Moscow. Instead, it provoked the reawakening of Russia's most dangerous ambition to prove that deterrence, not dialogue, still rules the world. This is how the new nuclear age began, not with a warhead explosion, but with a failed handshake. When the news of Russia's Burevestnik launch reached Washington, it landed like a seismic shock. The intelligence briefings came in fragments: satellite images, radar anomalies, intercepted chatter, and then the confirmation Russia had indeed launched a nuclear-powered cruise missile capable of staying aloft for days, even weeks. The Pentagon Situation Room fell into a tense, breathless silence. One official described it later as a moment when everyone suddenly realized we were living in a post-treaty world. For decades, the United States had operated under a doctrine of predictability, mutual deterrence, grounded in rules, verification, and negotiation. But the Burevestnik upended that. It was not simply a new weapon, it was the symbol of a new era, an era where treaties no longer mattered and where fear could once again drive policy. The White House's initial reaction was disbelief mixed with anger. The president condemned Moscow's action as reckless nuclear adventurism, warning that the U.S. will respond decisively to any threat to our security or that of our allies. Behind those words, however, lay unease. America's strategic calculus had been shaken. If Russia truly possessed a nuclear-powered missile with unlimited range, then the old logic of containment had evaporated. In the Pentagon, generals convened emergency sessions under the strategic modernization. The idea was clear: if Moscow had changed the game, Washington would not be left behind. Proposals flooded in, from new long-range hypersonic platforms to resurrecting nuclear propulsion projects abandoned in the 1,960 seconds. Congress, sensing both danger and opportunity, rushed to authorize billions for what one senator called a national rearmament initiative. Defense contractors' stocks soared overnight, and Washington's political machine had found new momentum. Yet, beyond the machinery of policy and profit, a deeper anxiety began to surface: that America had been caught flat-footed, distracted by domestic polarization, economic uncertainty, and a complacent belief that the Cold War's logic had been permanently retired. On Capitol Hill, the debate turned vicious. Hawks accused the administration of sleepwalking into vulnerability. Doves warned that rushing into a new arms race would only mirror Russia's folly. But for once, both sides agreed. On one point, the world had changed. The U.S. no longer faced a rival bound by treaties or transparency. It faced a Russia that wanted the world to remember its fear. Across think tanks and editorial pages, analysts evoked grim historical parallels. The launch was called the new Sputnik, a technological and psychological shock to remind the West that power still speaks louder than diplomacy. The irony was painful. A century after 2 world wars and decades of Cold War diplomacy, humanity seemed to be circling back to the same perilous logic it once swore to escape. I once warned that a civilization obsessed with dominance will always rediscover its own weapons before its conscience. That warning now seemed prophetic. The Burevestnik was not only a Russian weapon, it was the manifestation of a broader failure, the collapse of strategic imagination in Washington as much as in Moscow. Inside NATO, the fear was palpable. European allies demanded reassurance, pressing the U.S. to deploy more nuclear-capable aircraft and interceptors. The Pentagon obliged, but privately, American officials knew that no missile defense system could stop a low-flying nuclear-powered cruise missile that could literally circle the globe unseen. The uncomfortable truth was that deterrence had returned to its original brutal simplicity: mutual fear of annihilation. By the week's end, the White House convened a televised address to calm public nerves. The president stood before the nation and declared, "We will not be intimidated." Yet the tone was hollow, the eyes tired. Americans watching at home sensed it, the uneasy feeling that something irreversible had begun. The Burevestnik had not just tested Russia's power, it had tested America's confidence and found it trembling. The age of treaties, trust, and transparency had ended. What replaced it was something colder, darker, and infinitely more dangerous: a race without rules, guided not by strategy but by pride. And in that pride lay the seeds of the next great crisis. Across Europe, the news of the Burevestnik launch was received not as a headline but as a chill, the kind that creeps under the skin of a continent that has seen too many wars. Governments woke up to the realization that once again, Europe had become the front line in a standoff it did not start, could not control, and might not survive. The missile's theoretical range made every European capital, from Lisbon to Warsaw, from Rome to Helsinki, a potential target. The old ghosts of the 20th century were stirring again. European leaders rushed to issue statements of concern, but behind the diplomatic language lay a single emotion: fear. Fear of a new arms race fought over their skies, fear of a nuclear shadow stretching across the continent, fear of being reduced once again to pawns in an American-Russian confrontation. Yet Europe's tragedy is that it cannot afford to step away. Its economies, militaries, and even its sense of security are still tied to the United States through NATO, even as its energy and geography tie it uncomfortably to Russia. In Berlin, the tone was cautious. Chancellor emphasized that Germany stands firmly with its allies, but urged re-establishing channels of communication with Moscow. In Paris, Emmanuel Macron's response was sharper. If Europe becomes the theater of other powers' rivalry, we cease to be sovereign. His words carried both pride and despair. France still dreams of strategic autonomy, but it lacks the leverage to turn that dream into reality. In the East, however, the mood was the opposite. In Warsaw, the defense minister called for the immediate deployment of additional U.S. nuclear assets on Polish soil. The Baltic states echoed that call. To them, the Burevestnik was not just a symbol of Russian resurgence, it was a direct threat. For Eastern Europe, deterrence means proximity to American weapons. For Western Europe, deterrence means distance from danger. And in that division lies the quiet fracture of NATO unity. Brussels tried to project confidence. NATO's emergency meeting issued the familiar script, "We remain united in the face of Russian aggression," but insiders leaked that the atmosphere inside was tense, almost desperate. Some member states, Italy, Spain, Greece, warned against escalatory deployments that might provoke further Russian responses. Others, like the UK and Poland, pushed for decisive deterrence. The alliance, once seen as an unshakable pillar, now looked more like a family arguing at the edge of a cliff. Meanwhile, Europe's citizens began showing signs of fatigue and disillusionment. In Prague and Vienna, anti-nuclear protests re-emerged for the first time in decades. In social media threads across Germany and France, ordinary people asked the same haunting question: are we sleepwalking into another Cold War, or worse, a hot one? The sense of deja vu was overwhelming. Then there was the economic dimension, the part that European politicians dreaded most. Moscow's withdrawal from arms treaties brought renewed energy instability. Gas prices spiked overnight and markets wobbled under geopolitical uncertainty. Europe, still recovering from inflation and energy crises, found itself once again paying the price for global confrontation. Putin understood this perfectly. His government framed the Burevestnik not just as a military triumph, but as a psychological weapon, a reminder that Europe's comfort and prosperity depend on peace with Russia, not obedience to Washington. The Kremlin's media outlets hammered that message home. The Americans have oceans, Europeans have targets. It was cruel but effective. Europe, caught between dependence and defiance, finds itself paralyzed. It cannot fully confront Moscow, nor can it dictate Washington's strategy. It is both a shield and a hostage. The tragedy is not that Europe lacks power, but that it lacks unity of purpose. I might say that Europe's crisis is moral as much as strategic. A continent that once led in diplomacy, that once preached the virtues of peace and integration, now stands silent as missiles redefine its fate. The Burevestnik may fly unseen across the skies, but its shadow is already visible, stretching over the cities of Europe, darkening the promise of peace that this continent once gave to the world. The launch of the Burevestnik did more than unveil a weapon. It resurrected an entire worldview, one that many had hoped had been buried with the Berlin Wall. The return of cold logic, that unforgiving arithmetic of deterrence threat and counter threat, is now reshaping the global order. Washington and Moscow again orbit each other like two massive unstable stars, bound not by diplomacy but by fear. In the days following the missile test, both sides entered a new phase of strategic theater. Russia broadcast triumphant images of the Burevestnik soaring through polar skies, its contrail glimmering like a comet of vengeance. The United States responded with symbolic power displays, stealth bombers patrolling Europe, missile defense drills in Alaska, and the reactivation of strategic bases long left dormant. Every move was a message, every maneuver a line of dialogue written in the language of deterrence. But beneath this spectacle lies a deeper decay. The mechanisms that once kept nuclear powers Restrained treaties, hotlines, verification missions have withered. The last guardrails of the post-Cold War order are gone. What remains is improvisation leaders making existential decisions in an atmosphere of suspicion, nationalism, and political theater. There is no trust left, only calculation. The irony, as I might note, is that both Washington and Moscow are prisoners of the very doctrines they claim to master. Deterrence has become addiction, a belief that safety lies in the ability to terrify. Yet history teaches the opposite. The moment both sides begin to rely on fear as stability, stability itself vanishes. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the NATO bombing of Belgrade, and the invasion of Ukraine all were born from the same illusion that control can be maintained through escalation. Today, that illusion has evolved into something far more dangerous. The Burevestnik capable of indefinite flight represents a new paradigm, a world in which weapons no longer obey geography or time. A missile that can circle the Earth for days without detection erases the logic of warning and response. It redefines the meaning of deterrence. How can you deter something already airborne, waiting unseen? This is why the new era is not simply a Cold War II, it is something far more unstable, a world without symmetry. In the original Cold War, both powers understood each other's limits. They feared mutual destruction, yes, but also respected the boundaries of rationality. Today's leaders operate in a fractured environment of pride, domestic political pressures, and digital misinformation. Nuclear strategy has become politicized, broadcast, memed, and monetized. In such a world, one miscalculation could trigger catastrophe not through ideology, but through ego. Amid this chaos, voices of reason still flicker. The United Nations has called for urgent re-engagement on arms control frameworks. China and India, both wary of being drawn into another bipolar rivalry, have quietly offered to mediate a new global security compact. Yet Washington and Moscow remain locked in a dialogue of denial. Each believes time favors its side. Each mistakes the other's anxiety for weakness. And so the cold logic returns, colder, harsher, stripped of moral language. We are back to the basics: capability, credibility, and destruction. But there is something profoundly different this time. The leaders who hold the codes are no longer heirs to the generation that feared nuclear war. They are heirs to one that doubts it will ever happen, that complacency is the real danger. The story of the Burevestnik is not just a story about technology or geopolitics. It is at its core a story about us, about the human condition, in its most paradoxical form. We are a species capable of designing machines that can fly forever, yet incapable of sustaining peace for a generation. The missile that circles the Earth, endlessly carrying death on nuclear wings, is not merely Russia's creation. It is civilization's reflection, a mirror held up to the arrogance of our age. The collapse of the Hungary summit, the unraveling of the last nuclear treaty, and the triumphal launch of the Burevestnik are not disconnected events. They are chapters in the same tragedy, the slow death of diplomacy in an age of spectacle. Both Washington and Moscow now speak through demonstrations of power, not dialogue. The handshake has been replaced by the launch button. Each test, each parade, each televised declaration is a ritual in a new religion, the worship of fear as proof of strength. I once warned that great powers destroy themselves, not when defeated, but when they lose the capacity to imagine peace. That warning echoes now like a prophecy fulfilled. The US and Russia, trapped in a mirror of each other's insecurities, are chasing ghosts, ghosts of empire, prestige, and relevance. But what they are really chasing is the illusion of control in a world that has outgrown it. In this mirror, Europe sees its fragility, Asia, its calculation, and humanity, its denial. The Burevestnik's infinite flight path, untouchable, unseen, unstoppable, has become a metaphor for the moral drift of our time. It circles the globe like a dark reminder that power has escaped its purpose. There is no ideology left in this confrontation, no vision of a better world, only momentum. Like a machine that cannot be switched off, it flies because it was built to fly. And so the missile becomes the emblem of a civilization that has lost its compass. It is not the first weapon to symbolize fear, but it may be the last to symbolize permanence, the idea that humanity's creations will outlive its wisdom. There is still a way back, though. The path grows narrower with every launch and every lie. It will not come from grand declarations or summits that fail. It will come from humility, the rediscovery that power without conscience is suicide by another name. The great powers must learn once again that survival is not a strategy, it is a responsibility. For all its horror, the Burevestnik offers one last lesson. It shows that human ingenuity knows no limits and that only moral courage can give that ingenuity meaning. If the missile is our mirror, then the reflection it offers is both warning and plea that the greatest threat to humanity has never been the weapon itself, but the blindness of those who wield it. And as that missile continues its silent orbit through the skies, it asks a question that no leader seems ready to answer. If we can build something that flies forever, why can't we make peace that lasts? Thanks for watching.